Welcome in the first video on respiratory system. In this video, the explanation will be about nose and the structure that form them. Now, as a definition, nose is defined as a two cavities separated by a septum. Have a two opening of communication, one anterior and one posterior. The anterior one allow air entry via the nostril, or what we call the anterior nares. The posterior one open into the nasopharynx via the choanae, or what we call the posterior nares. Now, every cavity is surrounded by four walls, namely the roof, the floor, the medial wall or the septum, and the lateral wall. Now, in this figure, it illustrates the opening and the walls of the nose. Initially, we have the anterior opening of nose, which we call the nostril or the anterior nares, in which the air enter inside the nose. And posteriorly, we have the posterior opening of the nose, which leads to nasopharynx. And the direction of air will be from nostril toward the choanae. And from this view also we can see the lateral wall of the nose, and we can see the floor, which is the hard palate separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity, and we could also see the roof of the nose. The question now, the nose are made from bone or cartilage or both? The answer is both, because the anterior portion of nose is made up by hyaline cartilage and it is a movable part. Posteriorly, we have bony support. Nose is considered complicated in terms of bony framework that participate in its walls formation. Beginning with the anterior opening, as we said previously, nostril, it is the anterior dilatation of nose made up by cartilage. Above it, we have a vestibule in which thick and short hair are existed in order to filter air from dust, and these hair are called vibrissae. Now, in turn, we talk about the histology of the vestibule. We find it as same as skin, which is a stratified squamous keratinized epithelium with a sebaceous gland and a sweaty gland as well as hair follicle. We have a muscle that can move nostril, but its action could have a limitation in a human being, and its action could be more visible and prominent in animals like rats. Shifting toward the posterior opening of the nose, the choanae. A choanae leads to nasopharynx and it's surrounded by a bony framework. The question now, what are the approximate shape of a choanae? The choanae, it is almost oval in shape. We have two choanae, one on the right and one on the left. They are separated from each other by the vomer bone. Inferiorly and anteriorly, they are separated from the oral cavity by the hard palate, being more specific, the horizontal plate of palatine bone. And from each side laterally, we have a medial pterygoid plate of sphenoidal bone. The superior boundary, we have the ala of the vomer, the vaginal process of palatine bone, and more interestingly, we have foramen at the later one, called the palatovaginal foramen, which also lead to the nasopharynx. Now, in this view, we can see the inferior view of skull. We can see here the hard palate and the upper jaw teeth, and we can see each choanae. They are separated from each other by the vomer bone. The surrounding anteriorly and inferiorly, we can see the part of hard palate that are made by the horizontal plane of palatine bone, and laterally they are surrounded by the medial pterygoid plate of sphenoid bone here and here, and the superior boundary by the ala of the vomer and the vaginal process of palatine bone. These are each choanae. When we talk about the vomer bone, they are separated two choanae from each other. The medial pterygoid of sphenoid make the lateral surrounding of a choanae. The palatine bone or horizontal plate make the anterior and inferior plate of the choanae. The ala of the vomer or the vaginal process of palatine bone make the roof of each choanae. Finishing with the anterior and posterior opening of the nose, now we will talk about the walls of the nasal cavity. And as we stated previously, the nose are made up by four walls: the septum, the floor, the roof, and the lateral wall. Beginning with the septum, which is the medial wall that separates two nasal cavities from each other. Anteriorly, the septum is made of cartilage and it is a movable part. Posteriorly, we can find that the septum superiorly made of perpendicular or vertically process of ethmoidal bone and inferiorly it made of vomer bone. As you could appreciate in this figure, anteriorly it made up by cartilage, which is a movable part, posteriorly and superiorly perpendicular plate of ethmoid, and inferiorly we can see vomer bone. As you could appreciate also, vomer bone participate in separation of two choanae from each other. Now talking about the floor of the nasal cavity, it is the hard palate. And as we know, the hard palate is formed by the two bones. The anterior 2/3 by the palatine process of the maxilla, and the posterior 1/3 by the horizontal process of palatine bone. As you can see in this cross section, the superior view here for the hard palate, we can see the anterior 2/3 are made by the palatine process of maxilla. And here in the yellow, we can see the horizontal plane of palatine bone, making the posterior 1/3 of the hard palate. And the whole hard palate make the floor of the nasal cavity. Now talking about the roof. It's much easier to divide the roof into three parts. The first part, which is the anterior slope, the middle part, which is the horizontal, and the posterior part, which is the slope part. The first part, anterior slope, composed of nasal bone and nasal spine of a frontal bone. The second part, horizontal, it is made by the cribriform plate of ethmoidal bone. And as a note, the second part contains the olfactory neuron that it can transmit the smell to the olfactory bulb and to the olfactory nerve, which is the cranial nerve number 1. And the third part, which is the posterior slope, that composed of body of sphenoid bone, as well as the vaginal process of palatine bone and the ala of the vomer. As you could appreciate in this figure, we can see the roof of the nasal cavity. Anteriorly, it's made by the nasal bone and the nasal process of the frontal bone. In the middle, it is almost horizontal and made by the cribriform plate of ethmoidal bone, and posteriorly, mainly by the sphenoidal body. Now, lateral wall bones. We can divide the lateral wall into bones and the structure. Now, the lateral wall is made by different bones. The labyrinth of ethmoid bone being the most characteristic one because of the unique structure that participate in it, namely the superior and the middle concha. Other bone like maxilla, lacrimal bone, vertical plate of palatine bone, pterygoid plate of sphenoid, as well as the nasal bone all take place in the formation. When we talk about the lateral wall structures, we have 3 concha, 3 myiasis, and 1 recess in the lateral wall. Now the question, what is the concha? All the 3 conchas are shelves-like projection from the bony structures. And all the 3 myiasis are the spaces beyond these conchas. Superior, middle, and inferior concha with the corresponding myiasis, which is also superior, middle, inferior, being the myiatis below each concha. Now the recess, we have 1 recess, and it is the space that are located between the superior concha and the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. As you could appreciate in this figure, we can see the sphenoethmoidal recess located above the superior concha and below the cribriform plate of ethmoidal bone. And the name behind it is sphenoethmoidal recess because this recess, it drains the sphenoidal air sinus toward the nasal cavity. And these details will be covered in the next video. The superior and the middle concha, they are comes from the ethmoidal bone. Here is the superior concha and here is the middle concha. The inferior concha comes from the maxillary bone. Note that the corresponding myiatis are below each concha. Here we have inferior myiatis, here we have a middle myiatis, here we have the superior myiatis. We reached the end of this video. Further topics will be covered in the upcoming videos, and thank you.